Garland, after the shooting of the president, Oswald left the book depository as not as a suspect. He left the book depository and proceeded to go to his rooming house. He put on a jacket and left the rooming house, according to his landlady, at 1:02. What were the sequence of events after that?
That's a great question, Michael, and the sequence of events are in dispute. As you said, he did leave the Texas School Book Depository, apparently took a bus and a cab, got home, went in just for a few minutes. The housekeeper there said that she last saw him leave about 1:03 and that he was waiting for a bus, a northbound bus on Beckley Avenue, where the rooming house is. Now there's 5 key points, I think, here that we need to go over. We're going to put the map up so that you can see how all these points are interconnected and how they're so close together. You'll find this pretty interesting. So the first one is at Beckley Avenue, 1026 North Beckley. That is where the rooming house was. The second point at 10th and Patton, about 10 blocks away, is where Officer J.D. Tippit was killed. Another area that everyone is familiar with is the Texas Theater down here on Jefferson Boulevard. But there's 2 other places that are of extreme interest in this scenario that are not mentioned by the news media or the government story, and that is, here's where Jack Ruby's house apartment is, only about 6 blocks from where Officer Tippit was killed. And this is where the library on 10th, where one of the assailants of Tippit ran, according to police transcripts. And when the police converged there were Secret Service agents present. So the question, what we've been told is that Oswald walked down the street and was about 10 blocks away by 1:08 to 1:12 at the time that Officer J.D. Tippit was killed. However, the distance that he would have to cover there makes that somewhat questionable.
That was 0.9 miles, almost 1 mile.
It was almost, I would say between 3/4 to 9/10 of a mile, 7 to 9/10 of a mile. And he would have had to cover that in just slightly over 5 minutes, maybe 6 or 7 at the most. So that alone is somewhat questionable, whether or not he could have actually been at this spot at the time of that J.D. Tippit was murdered. If he did do that, the next point is question would be the witness accounts. Almost none of the witnesses identified an individual who would have fit the description of Lee Harvey Oswald there at the scene.
Matter of fact, weren't there witnesses who identified 2 people there at the scene of where Officer J.D. Tippit was killed, and neither one of these 2 people fit Lee Harvey Oswald's physical description?
That is exactly right, Michael. One of the witnesses, Aquila Clemens, stated that she saw 2 individuals. The sequence of events that we do know is that Officer Tippit was having a conversation with some individual who was walking down the street. He had pulled his car up and stopped, or had already been stopped. And there was a conversation that was pleasant, apparently through the vent window. And all of a sudden, Officer Tippit got out of the car. The conversation got a little bit more agitated. Suddenly, the assailant fired 3 shots across the front of the car, from one side to the other where Officer Tippit was, shooting him in the chest. Aquila Clemens, as you mentioned, who saw two individuals and mentioned, and as well as her testimony was corroborated, or her interview, said that then one of the assailants waved the other one off and went over and put the fatal bullet into Officer Tippett's head. And as you mentioned, neither one of the descriptions of the two assailants matched Oswald, because one was apparently short and stocky, the other was tall and thin. Oswald is, of course, short and thin. So neither description actually really matched.
And the taller one was wearing a long coat, according to his description. The couple of bystanders went over to Officer J.D. Tippett's car to radio in Officer Down. One of the bystanders could not get the radio to work it right. The other one stepped in and called it in, and that was logged into the Dallas police station at 1:15, 1:16, thereby also indicating that Oswald would not have had time to get to Tippett's car and murder Tippett. So why was Oswald even a suspect?
Well, at that time, as you know, Michael, Oswald, of course, was not a suspect. He was simply walking down the street, if he was even there at all.
That's right, but there was something that had to identify him as a suspect, because Oswald then proceeded to go to the Texas Theater, but before he got there, something alerted the police that Oswald was as they now call, a person of interest, and then they called him suspects.
Yes, there's a great deal of question around a wallet that was shown there at the scene with his false identification, A.J. Hadell, and that wallet was shown on a video by the camera crew that was there on the scene. That Officer Westbrook, I believe, Captain Westbrook, had that wallet. Eventually, the wallet was turned in, apparently, from the FBI. A lot of questions around that wallet and whether that was Lee Oswald's wallet, and if why was it not reported, and if so, was it planted in fact?
Well, Captain Westbrook examined the wallet, and what he said at that time, he and Special Agent Burrell were at the Texas Book Depository conducting an investigation when they heard over the radio that Officer Tippett had been murdered. And they immediately went to the scene of the Officer J.D. Tippett shooting. And it was described in testimony that the Officer Westbrook discovered the wallet near a pool of blood from Officer Tippett's body, and it was opened up at the time. And it had the identification of Lee Harvey Oswald, plus another piece of identification indicating the name, what was that?
A.J. Hadell.
A.J. Hadell. Now the A.J. Hadell name is very interesting, because that was the name under which supposedly Oswald ordered the Mannlicher Carcano rifle under J.D. Hadell. For some reason, Oswald didn't want to use his real name, if indeed Oswald did order that rifle. And it's perplexing on why he would even keep that name, the AKA name, in his wallet, because most certainly he would need that, and he wouldn't need to show it to anybody for identification. So Westbrook, Captain Westbrook, made a statement at the time, this is Lee Harvey Oswald, and they immediately connected Lee Harvey Oswald as an employee of the Texas Book Depository. So linking him to JFK's assassination and Tippett. So that's why they began pursuing Oswald, but because before that moment in time, nobody had assumed or thought of Oswald as a suspect. How do you see that?
That's right, and there's several other mysteries that go along with that. First of all, Oswald, as you know, Michael, his wallet was on his person at the Texas Theater, and it was recovered there. So,
and he had $13 with him. So typically you wouldn't have $13 in loose change in your pocket, you would have that in your wallet. And weren't 3 wallets logged in as FBI evidence?
Yes, they were. The third wallet, of course, is a red wallet that supposedly belonged to his wife, Marina. Some other interesting points here are that one is Tippit, as you know, was very close with Jack Ruby.
Matter of fact, no, you're absolutely right on that. Jack Ruby's sister described Tippit as being very, very close to Jack Ruby, and she described him as being that they were like brothers.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that was Eva Grant, and Eva managed the Vegas nightclub for Jack, and said that Tippit was a frequent visitor there. So they were quite close.
Well, I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
But not only that, how close was Tippit to Jack Ruby's house when he was shot?
And that's another fascinating point of this. Oswald, if he was walking down the street, as we have been told, was walking in the exact direction of Jack Ruby's apartment. Literally at the scene of that crime, there was only 6 blocks between Jack Ruby's apartment and the site where Officer Tippit was killed. There were about 10 blocks that Lee Oswald had already covered in that direction. So it appears that if what we are told is true, Lee Oswald was on his way to possibly to Jack Ruby's apartment.
Well, why would Oswald be going to Jack Ruby's apartment unless there was some type of association, previous association, between Oswald and Jack Ruby? What was that association, if any?
Yes, great question. We know that there have been several witnesses who have said that they had seen Jack Ruby and Lee Oswald together. So seems fairly clear that they knew each other from previous contact.
Do they know each other well, or is this just a casual meeting of Oswald happening to be in his bar?
Well, that is a great question. I think that based on the witness testimony that they were sitting together at a table. I think it was one of the cases. So it was something where they had contact, not just a happenstance of being there. Just like Tippit, of course, Tippit was much more frequent visitor and much closer to Jack Ruby than Oswald.
Well, that's interesting. So we have Jack Ruby being friends or associates with both Officer J.D. Tippit and Lee Harvey Oswald as a common point.
And the other thing, Michael, that's interesting is that the physical descriptions of the witnesses that saw the killing of Officer J.D. Tippit seemed to fit more to Jack Ruby as being short and stocky than they do to Lee Harvey Oswald, who was, of course, thin and short.
Well, that's very interesting because none of the witnesses ever identified Lee Harvey Oswald as the person having shot Officer J.D. Tippit. So without the billfold being at the scene, and it's hard to imagine if Oswald did do the shooting, why on earth would Oswald pull the billfold out of his pocket to have some cause to drop it at the scene? Mm-hmm. It almost seems as if that's planted evidence.
It does reek of something being very wrong. The other thing that's interesting here is that the shells that were found at the scene were found by Officer J.M. Poe, and he initialed the shells at the scene, the spent cartridges. There were, I think, 4 found, and neither he nor Detective Barnes could identify those shells when they were presented to them at the Warren Commission. The shells that were presented that allegedly matched Oswald's gun and ammunition did not match the ones that were found at the scene.
Further complicating that, when Oswald was apprehended at the theater, They turned on the lights, stopped the film, went in and apprehended Oswald, but not before he pulled out his gun, his .38 snub-nosed revolver, which was reported as having been fully chambered. All 6 rounds were in there, and as he went to shoot the apprehending officer, he hit him in the face with the gun as he was trying to draw down on him, and he pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. Now, it's interesting that all 6 rounds were back in the gun again, because he had emptied, someone had emptied, supposedly Oswald had emptied 4 of those spent cartridges, but the gun misfiring after supposedly it had just worked fine a few minutes earlier when, if that was the same gun used to kill Officer J.D. Tippit.
Right, and that leaves us with the question, was it Oswald who killed Tippit, or was it the individual who ran to the library and was chased by the Dallas police officers, who were then confronted with Secret Service personnel?
So you have to ask the question, when Oswald went to the theater, he was reported to have a relatively empty theater. He sat down beside one person, and after a few minutes he got up and went to the and bought some popcorn in the lobby with the money he had, and then came back and sat down beside another person for a few minutes, and then moved away and sat by himself prior to the police coming in. So it makes us ask the question, if Oswald were fleeing, where was he going and why? Or was he just intending to meet someone? In our last segment, we asked, where was Oswald going? Well, wherever he was going, he was destined never to get there, because he found himself at Dallas Police Headquarters. Garland, what's the sequence of events after that?
Well, Michael, Lee Oswald was interviewed for 12 hours. We have no transcript or information about what the Dallas Police Force found out. And then within 2 days, I think the assassination took place on a Thursday, and that Saturday, he was being transferred from the basement of the Dallas Police office over.
Let me stop you there for a moment, if I
Yes.
may. Was Oswald ever afforded an attorney?
Not that I'm aware of.
So he was held for 2 days and questioned. No notes were taken or made available, and he was never allowed legal counsel.
Very unusual, non-standard procedures.
Especially Miranda rights were in play at that time. And you have to assume he wasn't read his Miranda rights, or he had been offered an attorney. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's correct. And Oswald, of course, claimed that he was a patsy. He claimed that the picture of him holding the gun was
The Mannlicher Carcano?
The Mannlicher was, he claimed that was fraudulently put together. Claimed no involvement in either the Tippit murder or the President Kennedy's murder. After 2 days, the Dallas Police Force then transferred him to the county jail. You can see in this picture, in the basement, when he was being transferred, a man popped out of the crowd of reporters and shot Oswald in the abdomen and killed him. That man was Jack Ruby, as you can see in the next picture. Jack Ruby was a nightclub owner, managed nightclubs, one called Carousel, another the Vegas Club. And Ruby was then taken into custody for the murder of Oswald.
Didn't Jack Ruby have close ties with Chicago mobster Trafficante?
Well, he had close ties with quite a few folks. He had, first of all, close ties with many Dallas police officers that then allowed him to get into the basement there. The doors were unlocked, there were no security guards, so that was in fact very strange. But yes, he also had ties to quite a few mobsters, in Chicago, in Dallas. Specifically, we can talk about some of those. The first is he was fairly close with the Capizzi brothers in Dallas. He actually asked one of the brothers to come and visit him when he was in prison. The Capizzi brothers were very high in the Dallas underworld. They were lieutenants of Carlos Marcello out of New Orleans. But as you were alluding to, Michael, in Chicago, he originated from Chicago, and that was Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss, whom he was basically an associate of Giancana's and came up through that organization before moving to Dallas. Giancana was assassinated himself just before he was to testify before the House Select Committee on assassinations in around 1976 or so.
Now you mentioned that Jack Ruby had an association with Marcello out of New Orleans. Well, it's interesting to note that Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle was a lieutenant for Marcello and ran a bookmaking operation for him. So Lee Harvey Oswald was had that kind of association in the family and knew Marcello as well almost from the time he was born. So we've got a linkage there to Marcello with Jack Ruby, and a linkage to Oswald with Marcello.
Right.
And the linkage with Ruby to the Chicago mobster, and who supposedly owned or had an interest in Jack Ruby's bars.
That's right. Ruby apparently managed the bars. I'm not sure if he actually owned the bars. So, and there's also another connection that Oswald has to New Orleans, but before we get there, we have to probably mention that Jack Ruby himself ended up dying within the next couple of years in prison. He claimed that he was injected while he was there for a cold, and he believed that that was a cancerous type injections, and sure enough he did die of lung cancer within about a year, 2-year period. So many of these interconnections we still don't know because of his death.
As I recall, that was I remember reading about that. That was from the time the cancer was discovered, and he had medical attention in jail, but from the time the cancer was discovered until he died was a very, very short time. And it was also in the news at that time that I believe a Dr. Mary, who was associated with a medical facility there in New Orleans for the government, was working on fast-growing cancer cells that could be injected into folks whom the government might want to dispose of. Is there any credibility to that story?
Absolutely. That was a book about that with Edward T. Haslam, and Dr. Mary Sherman also is kind of connected to this whole thing in New Orleans as well through David Ferry. David Ferry supplied logistical support for Dr. Sherman for the operation that you were talking about. David Ferry, it has a connection with Lee Harvey Oswald. David Ferry used to be the commander of Lee Harvey Oswald's Civil Air Patrol Unit in 1955 in Louisiana, near Lakefront, and we can have a picture of David Ferry there and his commander and Lee Oswald. There they are together at that Civil Air Patrol Unit.
There's also another anomaly in that it is proven that David Ferry had CIA connections as a pilot for the CIA.
That's absolutely true, and David Ferry certainly was a pilot, as was another pilot, a CIA pilot, Barry Seal. Barry was also a CIA pilot who was in the very same Civil Air Patrol as Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald know Barry Seals from any other associations other than being together in the Civil Air Patrol there in New Orleans?
As far as we know, he did not. Well, I don't know, there could have been other associations, but we don't know that so far. But before we leave the connections here, I wanted to go back to the Chicago connections for Jack Ruby. We talked about Sam Giancana and his death directly before the House Select Committee assassinations. The question that raises is, who killed Sam Giancana and why? Well, the family has said repeatedly that they believe it had to be somebody who was very, very close to Sam Giancana, because he would not have even opened up the door before he was going to testify unless it was a friend.
Before he's going to testify to?
House Select Committee on Assassinations. So they implicated a man named Johnny Rosselli. And Johnny Rosselli, they believed, was possibly responsible for the killing of Sam Giancana.
Now, Johnny Rosselli had worked for Sam Giancana in the Chicago mob, and he was, Rosselli, I understand, was sent to Los Angeles to establish a base out there. So Rosselli and Sam Giancana were very close at that time.
Yes, and of course Rosselli himself also ends up dead within another year, just before he is going to testify further for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Rosselli is found in a drum in Dividing Bay in Florida.
55-gallon drum with his legs gone.
That's right, dismembered body, and that was the end of Johnny Rosselli. Now, the Mafia head in that area was Santos Trafficante. Santos Trafficante has connections to the CIA and had, in fact, even up until his death, was identified as still being involved in civilian distribution for drug trafficking, a CIA operation running out of Southeast Asia and the Golden Triangle, as drugs were coming, heroin from Burma to General Kunsaw, and distributed under U.S. government control through all the way to...
I think I made a misstatement earlier. I stated that Trafficante was from New Orleans, but wasn't he from Tampa?
Yes, Martin, no, you said it correctly. Trafficante is from Tampa, Florida, and Marcelo was based in New Orleans.
And Trafficante had extensive connections going into Cuba and had connections into Cuba prior to Batista's overthrow, didn't he?
That's correct, and Trafficante had nightclubs down there during the reign of Batista that Castro eliminated. So the Mafia lost their business interest when Castro had come to power there.
This is getting to be a very, very tangled web. There are lots of direct connections with a lot of folks. So tying all of this back to the Warren Commission, stating that Oswald was a lone gunman seems to be getting dimmer and dimmer, especially with what, if you'd remind the audience, what the House Select Committee said on the Warren Commission report.
Well, the House Select Committee did conclude that Oswald was acted as part of a conspiracy that they believe. Another important person, very quickly, was his handler. We believe that many as Baron George de Mohrenschildt, who helped him reestablish
his CIA handler.
His CIA handler. He, as you know, Oswald defected to Russia and then married his wife there, and then easily came back into America. He was established, helped by George de Mohrenschildt. George de Mohrenschildt was also killed before he testified before the House Select Committee.
And in giving credibility more to the House Select Committee than the Warren Commission, Secretary of State John Kerry, just this week on Meet the Press, made a statement that just shocked everyone, that Oswald did not act alone. Our Secretary of State, John Kerry, made that statement, much to the surprise of everybody, and biographer, Dolores Kearns Goodwin was absolutely shocked at that statement.
And of course, she is a known plagiarist anyway for her previous work. I had to settle out of court for plagiarism. So that leaves us with the question, with all these CIA connections, what was their relationship with the president, and would they have had a motive to kill him?
I think we're going to explore that in our next segment.
Where do you come down on the conspiracy theories?
To this day, I have serious doubts that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone.